And we are live. Good morning, afternoon, day, night, everyone. Welcome for joining the Icinga for Windows 1.6.0 preview and Q&A. I hope you can understand me, that everything is working properly and fine. If you hit just a little in the chat, if it's fine, if you can hear me, I would appreciate it very much. So we can start directly with the live stream. I hope everything works. And yeah, basically what we're going to do today is that we will talk about Icinga for Windows 1.6.0, which we will release next week on Tuesday. And the idea of the live stream now is to show you what's new, what we did, and also to collect some feedback, to answer some questions, to ensure that we have a very smooth release of Icinga 1.6.0 or Icinga for Windows 1.6.0. In addition, we will also provide a blog post on Tuesday, which will summarize most of the things, but just for some basic discussions and some basic show-off. So basically, what's new with 1.6.0? One issue we had in the past is that we fixed the file writer and reader. So basically, you were able to corrupt your configuration files or your cache files for metrics you collect behind. That's fixed. We did lots of tests there to ensure that cross-reads, cross-writes no longer enhance anything or destroy anything. We enforced the framework code cache. We also made the Icinga management console ready for production. We added some repository management handling, implemented JR support, and lots of other bug fixes. Now, basically, I talked about fixed file writer and reader already. It's basically that we had some issues that for some reason when you restarted the system, that your cache file, when you collected CPU metrics, for example, in the background, that these files became corrupted, that they couldn't be read, or in some rare cases that the config was corrupted, and that caused, for example, your background daemons to no longer work. That's resolved with 1.6.0. And yeah, a nasty bug, but we fixed it. More importantly, however, we will now enforce the framework code cache. So if you missed it, with Icinga for Windows 1.4.0, we implemented the framework code cache, which collected all files the Icinga PowerShell framework had, bound it in one file, and then based on that, we loaded the framework, we executed commands to speed up the entire loading process, but also reduce the CPU load for initializing Icinga for Windows in first place. Now with 1.6.0, it's no longer optional. The entire commands to manage the code cache have mostly been removed. Only the write code cache command is remaining. And this file is always present. It's always managed by Icinga for Windows. So in case you update the framework, it will automatically be updated like before. But if you install 1.6.0 now, the code cache is always on. It's always enabled. So what you need to do is when you do manual modifications to the framework, you will always have to rebuild the cache. But we will go into that deeper later in the live demo part. The reason why we did it is, in first place, we wanted to increase the performance, of course, but in addition, we also required it for a JR later on. We will talk about. Another thing is the Icinga management console for Icinga for Windows is now stable with 1.6.0. So basically, we will move everything from management directly to the management console for easier administration, easier configuration, and in addition, it will allow you to basically create template-like configuration for your hosts, and then you can use this configuration to deploy on another host. And you can also manage the installation and update of components, including removing of components. So we will go into that in the demo later on. We added Icinga for Windows repositories with 1.6.0. So the biggest problem we had in the past or prior to 1.6.0 is this, that when you had, for example, you wanted to install plugins, then MS SQL plugins, Hyper-V plugins, and so on, we had different URLs and locations from where you had to install them. So if you, for example, had a DMZ zone and you wanted to install components on your machines, then you always had to provide the full path to every single component you wanted to install. And that's obsolete now, because we now provide on packages Icinga.com for Icinga for Windows an own repository. We included in repository management directly into Icinga for Windows. It's directly built in, so you can install your component, you can update your components. You can also sync repositories from example packages Icinga.com to your local machines or your network zones and install components from there. That's very, very cool, very, very easy. And yeah, one other big topic we have is Icinga for Windows JR profiles. Now, JR stands for Just Enough Administration. And basically what it is, it's similar to sudos on Linux, for example. So you grant a user system level permissions, so everything is run in a system context, but you can only execute certain commands. So for example, if you want to monitor your CPU, you will have to grant permission to execute invoke Icinga check CPU and all related commands to ensure that the monitoring is possible. You can also, for example, grant access to get service, but not to restart service. So you can fetch the information of services regardless of what service it is, but you can't restart or stop it, for example. That's a huge benefit, because this will allow us to ensure that monitoring is not only more secure, but also it gets rid of managing permissions for WMI calls, for Hyper-V, for example, for cluster services, because everything is run on the system level. You have access to these components and you can simply monitor them without having to manually check what kind of permissions the user is having. And yeah, it makes things a lot easier. And that's basically a short summary of what we did. And I wanted the presentation part as short as possible, because I will need more time regarding the demo. So if you have questions, by the way, just feel free to ask them directly. I will go into every single question and discuss it and talk about it, because I think that's very important, because it's also here to show off, but also have a questions and answer part. So when we have a look on packages Icinga.com, for example, we now have Icinga for Windows at the top. If we click on it, we have, similar to the other repositories or the other directories, we have our simpler kickstart script that's located directly here. We have snapshot, we have stable with a lot of components, as you can see. And we also have a short documentation on how to add repositories to Icinga for Windows 1.6.0. And that's basically not the main entry point, because that one will be the documentation that will follow on Tuesday with the release. But I wanted to show this part because that's very, very cool and important. If you want to install development builds for certain GitHub branches, you can add a project at a branch to these variables, and then you can install components based on a certain branch, for example. That's very, very cool, because it will allow you to easier manage your environment or to test certain parts, for example. Now, if you want to get started, we entirely redesigned the installation process of Icinga for Windows with 1.6.0. So, just for clarification, old installation methods still work and are still supported. So if you were using the Start Icinga Agent Install wizard, it's still supported. It does not come with the latest features because we will entirely move to the Icinga Management Console for that. So the new startup script is Icinga for Windows that you found on packages.icinga.com or can find on packages.icinga.com. And this is the new handling of getting started very easily on a system that has access to the internet. Of course, you can also use this script file in your own location. So simply copy it to your Icinga server, for example, and then you can get started with it. When we run this code, then you will be greeted with the, let's say, already known prompts where you want to install Icinga for Windows to. Let's say we want program files, for example. It will download a framework, but the difference is that it will now use the repository manager behind. So it will now connect to a certain repository and download the Kickstarter and the PowerShell framework directly from there. So you can define your custom locations for Icinga for Windows for the new handling. And then you will be greeted with a message. Do you want to run the Icinga Management Console? So no longer will you be prompted with the installation wizard. You will be granted with the Management Console. If you print yes, you can use Icinga-manage to open it. And here is the Management Console. And right now we have 1.5.2 installed on the system. Why? Because by default it will go to the stable release package, and the stable release package, of course, only provides 1.5.2 because 1.6.0 is not released yet. So, what we can now do is let's uninstall everything again and have a look on the new handling. So we have uninstalled everything. Let's double check that just to make sure that everything is working properly. Yes, it's no longer here. And what we can now do is we can add a different repository to our environment. So we have an argument for this script that is being downloaded. It's called simply Icinga repository. And we can go here, Icinga for Windows, stable, or snapshot. Snapshot is a snapshot repository. We can install Icinga for Windows entirely from there. And now if we run the script again, then, wait, what? Okay, that's funny. That shouldn't have been a problem. It's not in the snapshot repository. That's sad. Okay. I just updated everything and yeah, I missed that part. Okay. Let's move on differently. Then we'll do it a different part because we can, of course, also still use the old handling to install or update components. So if I'm here in the framework, for example, so if you have 1.5.2 installed already, you can simply update with the old commands, install Icinga framework update, framework URL, and then install it from that package. Agent is not installed yet. And if we run Icinga, then we have Icinga for Windows 1.6.0. The experimental flags are gone. Everything is more clean now. And basically, that's the new version. And as you can see here now, we have installation, install components, update components, remove, manage, and so on. So what you can also do is you can list your environment and have a look on what is actually installed. For example, we have the framework with version 1.6.0 installed. We have some configurations here that are most important, required for support cases. So which version of PowerShell is installed, which operating system, and so on. That's everything now properly listed directly within the shell. And of course, we can now move forward with the installation of our system. So basically, we have right now no repository installed. If I hit install components, there is nothing there. If I hit update components, there is nothing there because we did not define a repository yet because we haven't done the installation. If we do so, that's the part. We installed Icinga for Windows with the Kickstarter, and now we're in the management console. And basically, we go to installation. And now the wizard is much more user-friendly than the old wizard, because now we can actually have some questions here, which are very much better readable. And in addition, we can press H for help. And then we get a detailed description of what each point actually means, what the configuration point means, what is done. So we can also hide it again with H. And then we press 3 because I want to use the Icinga Director Self-Service API. And then we are prompted, please enter the URL pointing to your Icinga Director. We can press H again. And then we have some examples here on how the URL should look like. So it's much more cleaner, much more user-friendly. We now head to our Icinga web. And then I simply copy the URL, right-click, and add it there. I can also use D to remove it again and add one. So you can entirely manage it very easily. In addition, you have 1 of 1. If I enter another value now, I can get an error that you can only add one value. So basically, if you had the value, remove it with D. Now we move on. Now it asks for a self-service API key. Again, we can press H, and then we get a description on where you can find the self-service key to ensure that everything is working more reliable. Do you plan to do such sessions on a regular basics and maintain then on YouTube? Yeah, we can totally do so. I can talk to the Icinga guys to do this more frequently and for every release. That's fine. Yeah, we can do so. Yeah. So what we can now do is we head to our templates. Generic agent, that's the template I'm using, the agent tab, and then we copy the API key. And then we simply add the key. It's now listed there, and we press continue. That's it. So, and now, if you remember the old wizard, that was a total mess, because now you asked, do you want to override arguments? Do you want to run everything now? Are you sure that everything is okay? And now we get a very basic overview. We have our URL for the director, the self-service key. We have the host name that's now decided based on the configuration within the self-service API. So if you're inside the director, you have self-service API right here. And based on that one, it will transform host name, transform to lowercase. That's the configuration. And also host name without domain. these two options decide now, based on the initial configuration, that we will use the host name in lowercase. We have our CA server for the certificate validation. And yeah, that's basically now the absolute basic. Now, here is one important thing right now when you use the self-service API with the management console. You have the point here for director register host. Do not register host inside Icinga director. If I want to continue right now, start installation is not enabled. And you see here, to install this host while using self-service API, you need to register the host in the previous step first. So, what does that mean? You have to press 4 and register the host inside the Icinga director. Why? Because if you hit A for advanced, then you will see a lot more detailed configurations, what you can actually do. So this is here I am. This is the basic configuration. That should be fine for most people, for everyone. If you hit A now, you get to the advanced topics, because now you can start to override director arguments. For example, the agent version is defined to install 2.12.4. But we can also, for example, change that here to install another version. We can also entirely deny to install the agent directory, the service, and so on. We can define most parts directly here. As you can also see, the ticket is empty because we have no ticket fetched from the director because we have not registered the host. Now, here's the point on why we are doing not a pre-registration. If you do not register the host right now and you do modifications, let's say we say 8, we change the version of the agent, press D, now 2.12.3 for example, then we have changed this to 2.12.3. If we hit now continue, we can still not install it, but we can print our installation command with 2. And now, this is the new installation command for the new Icinga for Windows versions. Install Icinga, install command, and now we have the argument agent version. We set it to 2.12.3. We have our self-service API key and the director URL. So what you can do is, if you do not register the host right now, you can create your installation command that you can run on every single host in your environment to simply install them with the director self-service API and by overriding arguments shipped by the director. So if you want to install 2.12.3 and not 2.12.4, you can simply override it in that way. Once you register the host, the key will change, because then the key is the local key of the host. You can, of course, also override it later on manually, but that's just one important part, that you have to change the key later on. So every configuration you are doing right now is only applying if you do not register the host in first place. If you do register the host, then we set 2.12.3 as the agent version. If I now hit register host, it's now 19. I hit it. Register host inside director. Then it will register the host. And then you will see we have now the parent endpoint addresses also shipped, because now we have the custom configuration for the host based on our zone location. We get everything out of it. And as you can see, the agent version is overwritten again, because when we override, if we register the host, then all arguments that you defined prior are overwritten. So basically you have to decide if you want to install the host right now, then you need to register it. If not, just leave it alone. And if we hit the installation command again, then we will now see that this self-service key changed. So if you accidentally registered the host, if you did some modifications whatsoever, or if you want, for example, to actually overwrite the parent address, for example, let's say 2B is wrong, you want to be a different IP address. Then you can do so. If we now hit installation command, then you will see the argument is also listed here. Only arguments you change are listed within the configuration command. So everything that's set to default is simply defaulting to Icinga for Windows defaults. And if you override it, then it will be applied here. So if we do so and revert it, then I'm pretty sure that one will work. And yeah, so basically you just have to override the self-service key just and make sure you change that. Okay, now let's simply install it. You could, by the way, also export an answer file. And by default, it's the home directory of the current user you're running it. It's called EFV answer JSON or IFW. And you can also use the install command of Icinga to run it directly from the answer file. That's also possible. Now we hit start installation. And basically, if you used the management console before, that's basically the handling. It's identical to before. It will now configure the agent, it will install it, and do everything as you configured before. And now we are done, and it will return to the main menu in 5 seconds. So now the installation is done, and we can now run manage environment, for example. We can run, oh no, I moved the topic. If you hit installation again, you have now the option for a new configuration, or you can reconfigure your environment. So this is only applying to when you already installed it with the management console before. You can reconfigure your environment, and then all settings you did before are stored within the Icinga for Windows configuration. And what you can now do is you can modify your configuration here and simply rerun the configuration without having to enter everything again. So every single configuration is stored locally that you did. That's quite cool. Now let's have a look on list environment. And then we see we have now the agent 2.12.4 installed. And because we are running the Icinga stable repository, which is added with the new Icinga for Windows Management Console installer, or I will call it IMC in the future, then we see we have a repository installed from packages icinga.com. And because we have the new repository installed for stable builds, we now get the option that, hey, there is a new agent version available. That's the one that's installed. And based on our installed repositories, it tells us there is a new version available for this specific package. Now, if we go back with P, we can also run 2 for update components. And then we see here, yeah, we can update from 2.12.4 to 2.12.5 now. Very simple. We can press 0, and then we could run the entire update process, for example. We can also simply say no, and then it will not update anything. We can also install components with 1, and now, based on our release package, it will look up every single component that is installed, and then, for example, we can install plugins. And we can directly install it from the management console very easily. And if you want to run it, for example, more advanced in an automation mode, and you go, okay, I want to install the latest MS SQL version, but how do I do it? You simply press L. And what it will do now, it will print you the installation the command assigned to this management console entry. So if you run this command on your shell, then it will install the API checks 111. So every single command that's assigned inside the management console can be printed by L, and then you can install everything. Very easy, very straight forward, for example. Now, what's not possible is you cannot manage snapshots with the management console. We decided against it. So if you want, press X, you leave the management console, and now if we head to packages Icinga.com again, we have snapshot builds from Icinga for Windows, and we simply can run this command to install our snapshot repository. If I run the command again, it will prompt me with an error that is the repository is already added, and we can re-edit with false, and then it's there. Now, what we can do: search Icinga repository, name REST API, for example. By default, it will look up now the stable versions of the REST API. We have Icinga stable, that's our source, and that's the packages inside. We can now add snapshot, and then we see REST API 1.6.0 is available. It's not actually 1.6.0, it's just a generic approach we did here for the snapshots. So 1.6.0 is wrong here. It's 1.2.0 or 1.3.0, I think is the latest version then. I think 1.2.0. So basically that's it. We can also simply install it by using install Icinga component. So the old command install Icinga framework component is still present because we want to maintain backwards compatibility. But the new is simpler. Everything that has framework inside, simply skip it. It's install Icinga component now, name REST API. We want to install it from snapshot. And then it will tell you, okay, we found a package in Icinga snapshots from this URL. Do you want to install it? We press yes, or by default, it defaults to yes. Then it will download the REST API from GitHub directly, and you're done. And 1.2.0 is the latest version. Basically, the point is that the repositories will still link, for example, to GitHub or to your local file locations on your local disk or your network share or your own Icinga web server, but it will allow you to manage the entire collection on where you can find everything. We can also install the API checks, for example. Same procedure. And we can also install the plugins from snapshots. Now we can also run confirm, for example. Then the message will no longer prompt. That's required for automation, for example, that there's no message that will interrupt you. And you can also run force, for example. This will install the current version over an already installed version. So if you have 1.6.0 installed and you want to reinstall it, you use force and then it will be reinstalled. Otherwise, it will prompt you with an error that it's already installed and it will not override it by default. Now, these components are installed. Everything is fine. We can have a list environment now again. And then we will see we have our snapshot repository now installed. We have the plugins with 1.6.0, the framework with 1.6.0, REST API, API checks, and the agent installed. So everything fine right now. We can also have a look on L, for example. That's not working here. Because we can also run this everything. We simply show Icinga. That's the command behind. And then you get also the entire list, the entire configuration list. The management console just makes it easier because as the entire project grows, it's harder to actually remember any command. Now, we can of course also, let's install a component. Let's install MS SQL, for example. It's not found in the version, okay. Yeah, that's a bug. I will fix that by Tuesday. So we can do remove components as well. So basically, if you have the API checks, the plugins, the REST API, everything installed, you can simply remove them here as well, including, for example, with the agent, with the program folder. So you do not require to remember your commands. You can simply run it from here. And what we will do, we will install the service. I will do it outside now because of the snapshot repository is added, the installation is not working. I need to fix that. I just figured it out. We install the service, and as before, there is no specific command to install the service right now because the framework will know if you install the service. It's the Icinga PowerShell service. It will look it up in the repository and will handle it accordingly. As you can see, it's now installed. And we can now hit manage again, for example. And then we can call remove components. And now you can uninstall the service again and also uninstall the service and delete, for example, the service binary. That's very easy, straightforward. Everything directly added to the console. Now, we can also manage the environment. We can manage the Icinga agent. Of course, that's already what was present. We can enable and disable features. We can also print us the commands that are used by the management console for that. So that's very, very easy. And we can also have a look, for example, on the log file. It will open a new shell and it will read the content of the log file itself, and we can simply close it if we are done. Also, restarting the agent and so on is possible. We can't start the agent because the agent is already started. We can only stop and restart it. So there's also some basic logic behind these. Now, we already configured some repositories. There are some defaults available. That's our Icinga stable, Icinga snapshot. You can also add infinite repositories, your own repositories. It doesn't matter. It will look up every repository and get the ones that actually handles it. Sorry, I'm a little bit late. We have productively very secure Windows server, so they have no connection to the internet. Could you make an offline repository and network for Icinga for Windows? Yes, I will show that just in a moment, but that's possible. So what we can do is we can show all Icinga repositories that we have currently installed. We have snapshot, we have stable. We can also move a repository to the top, for example. So basically, the order of the repositories is responsible on how they are fetched. That's the reason that all the fun new things are not usable for us. They will be. I will just show you in a moment. That will be possible. So for example, if I want that the stable repository is always applied first, I simply press 1. Then it tells me I want to use it to the bottom. No, I want to the top. Here. Wrong menu. So now I can simply switch the order of the repositories and move them to the top or to the bottom. So I can rearrange them and ensure that, for example, my own repository, my custom repository for certain DMZ zones is on top and the other ones are on the bottom. I can also disable repositories, for example. I can disable the snapshot repository right now. it's no longer listed here in the disabled repository because it's already disabled. If I hit enable, then I have the enabled snapshot repository here. And if I go to show Icinga repository list, I see snapshot is now disabled. Offline repository is the name for it. Yeah, that's true. We can also remove repositories if you want to. And yeah, that's basically a very quick idea on how you can manage certain parts. Now, as the question already was asked in the chat, what happens if I have no access to the internet? Now, here's the solution for that. There is a command that's called sync Icinga repository. Now, what you can do is you provide a name. Let's call it my local stable Icinga. Then the path. The path is now the location of the repository it will be cloned to. So, for example, let's see users public Icinga stable. The remote path is now the path from which you will access the files from. How I explain that? If, for example, because there's one possibility you can do, you can clone repositories and sync them to a Linux share, for example. So if this is your location locally, every file is synced from there. If you, however, now define that C users public Icinga stable is available over a network, for example, then your remote path, for example, would be my computer Icinga stable. Okay, he will give the answer at this moment, I think. Yeah, exactly. So, path is the directory where everything is synced into. Remote path is from where they are accessible. So, for example, if you have a network share or if your machine that you're currently running on is your central server then for your DMZ zone, then you can provide this as remote path, and this is the one that will be added to the repository and everything will be linked to. And then we have the source, and the source is, for example, packages Icinga.com, the stable repository. We can use SCP, for example. If we use SCP, then this has to be a Linux server. It will then use SSH and SCP to copy all the files you sync to the remote Linux system. That could be, for example, your Icinga satellite or your Icinga master. And there's already, inside the docs, it's a little more detailed on how the configuration works. We can use the skip SCP make dir, we can use force and force trust, and so on. But let's move forward with this right now. What we do is, stable does not exist, it will be created, and now it will download every single file that's inside this repository up here into our local user public Icinga stable. At least they should be here then. Takes a while. Because to ensure that everything is handled properly, they will be synced in a temporary directory, and then they will be analyzed. The file hashes will be checked against to ensure that everything is fine. And once the repository file hash is valid and the component file hash is valid, then it will be transmitted. So that takes a while. I think 212.5 is the only one available. As you can also see, 32-bit, 64-bit, everything is here within the repository. We now have the components, the other ones, the plugins, REST API, and so on. And then the repository is synced, it's checked, and now we have our files here. Now, if we use show Icinga repository, then we have my local stable, and we can then run, for example, the management console or disable it from CLI and say disable Icinga repository, Icinga stable. Now, both of them are disabled, and only my local stable is now available. And we can run the management console, for example, again. We run install components. And we have, for example, MS SQL 1.2.0. We have every single repository disabled. We hit 0. We hit 1, yes. And now, yeah, that was too quick. Now we received an error, and that's basically what I wanted. MS SQL. Because the provided URL, this is now where he tries to look up the repository. And that's basically now a network share with my computer, or my computer was the network share I attached. So basically, if you have your network share or something else configured properly, this can also be a web resource, for example. If you have is your own Icinga server defined, then this could be https icinga.mycompany/Icinga for Windows/stable. And then it will look up every component right there. That's how you can actually do it. So, let's have a quick fix on that this works. So it's a simple JSON file you can generate. And now it works. Now it will download the component from this location and install it. So basically, if you sync a repository, you can also do something like this. Sync Icinga repository, name testing, path is test, remote path, and this is, for example, now for Linux. It would be, let's say, no idea. Icinga 2 example, I'm just making this up. Our source is then packages icinga.com. And then we simply have to use SCP. And then, that's wrong. Yeah, I screwed that. No, sorry, I screwed it up. Forget what I said. So it's path var www Icinga stable, for example. That's how it works. Path is your SSH user, for example, your Linux directory, and the remote path could be Icinga 2 example.com Icinga stable. There's also an example inside the docs. And then what you require is SSH and SCP installed. I would highly recommend having SSH keys installed because there are 4 actions taking place and you would have to prompt or to enter your password 4 times. So SSH keys are highly recommended. Very nice. I can provide an Icinga for Windows repository in my Icinga 2 server environment. Exactly. That's what you can do. Yes, and also, for example, you can sync from your local Windows machine from the internet. You can sync all components to your Icinga server. And from the Icinga server, you can then sync it to different network zones. So what's also possible is you can run, for example, pass users public test repository, remote pass. I leave it empty. If you leave it empty, then it defaults to the pass. And as source, we now use C users public Icinga stable. Yeah. And what it will now do, it will use our repository that we synced from packages Icinga.com, which is that one. It will sync everything from there into there. So you can also, resync everything. So let's see here. We have now a test repository, and now we have it synced here. So you can also sync from a sync, from a sync, from a sync, from a sync. I hope that's clear. And what you can do is you can run update Icinga repository, and then it will resync every single repository that you have defined. So if you are on your local machine and you want to update your repository on your local Icinga server, you can run update Icinga repository, then it will resync every single file to your Icinga server, and then on your shares on your DMZ, for example, on your distributed environments, you can simply resync everything again. And then you can simply install it. You can also simply run update Icinga with a force argument, and then we'll update every single component that is pending an update. And for example, you could automate this as well. So once you update the repository and there's a new version available, then it will simply update it. So it's a lot easier to manage the entire environment, to manage components and everything related. Now the resyncing is complete. And for example, what we can do is, and then I will stop with the repository part because I have other things to talk about as well. We can use the log component. Log Icinga component, name agent, and let's say we pin it to 2.12.4. Now, when I hit the management console again and hit list environment, then what will now happen is that our agent, our version, has a little asterisk here behind. And that means that these versions are locked. If you now want to update this component, it will not be updated unless it's 2.12.4. If you have 2.12.3 installed, then it would update. Now as we have 2.12.4 installed, and it's locked to that, it will not update to 2.12.5. Now, if I hit back, update components, as you can see, the agent is not here because the agent is locked to its version, which means it will not be updated during an update process. And that's quite cool. Now, let's move on a little because we have another huge topic we have to talk about, and that's manage JR profile. That's 2. So, JR, everything looks well thought out. Great work. Are there plans to further optimize performance, minimize CPU usage by PowerShell framework checks? Yes. We plan something for 1.7.0. That's a collaboration with Icinga directly, with the Icinga agent. We hopefully can talk about more about that on this year's open source monitoring conference. We have something in mind, and we are looking forward to that. There are some workarounds available right now that will minimize CPU usage. And one workaround is very promising right now, which we will continue on. So, yeah, we will do that. So, let's have a quick look on our monitoring. Let's simply deploy our checks. And we should have one host here that's sitting here the entire time and hopefully doing some checks. Yes. So, we have now our system configured. We can run everything. Everything is fine. And the problem is right now we are running a service user as the NT Authority Network Service. Now, the problem is using this service has some drawbacks because you can't, or you shouldn't manage custom individual permissions for this user because it will have effect on other services as well using the server. Now, with Icinga for Windows 1.6.0, we provide the possibility to use JAIR. Just enough administration. As I talked before, it will ensure that certain users only have permission to access certain topics within a PowerShell. But in addition, these users or every command will be run in an elevated shell as in a system context, but limited to what they can actually do. Now, what we implemented is now two things. We implemented an entire JAIR profile writer, and we added the handling to install a managed user. The user is called Icinga, and this user will entirely be managed by Icinga. We will see performance GPU uses my theme, two of our servers with high load every time. Yeah, I will talk about it in a moment because we have some future plans here. But I can give a short summary. Sorry, my theme too. Don't worry, all fine. So, what we can do now is we can install JAIR profile with managed user Icinga. What this will do, it will create a local user that's called Icinga on the local Windows machine. This user does not have permissions to log in locally. It has no RDP connection permission. It's in not any group present. It's simply a plain user, and the only permission it will have is to run as a service. Now, if we do that, we press 0, and then we press enter. Yes, it will install the user Icinga. It will update every single service that we are running. Icinga 2 and Icinga PowerShell framework will be updated to run with the new user. And then we will create a PowerShell framework dependency catalog. And then based on that, we will compile the JAIR profile catalog. That's very, very, very quick. Then Icinga for Windows will be registered. The services will be restarted. And we are done. That's it. If we hit services now, wait, it's called that. If we have a look, Icinga, PowerShell service, it's very small right now. Both services are now running with a user Icinga. I can show it way better. Icinga 2. It's configuration, I think. Yeah. Service user is now Icinga. If here right now we have a check, that's very good that this check was executed. I hope it works now. Before the JR profile was running, our Icinga user has no permission to access performance counters. And as we see right now, the check executed again and everything works. Here's the same thing. Win time. Invoke Icinga check time sync is not part of the JR context. I wonder why. It should be inside. Interesting. So basically the point is that if you run it as simple user Icinga without the JR profile, then you have the problem that the Icinga user has no access to performance counters or, for example, the memory objects and so on. But as we install the JR profile, then the user has now access to execute every single command that we have right now without you noticing it, and you no longer have to worry about permissions. That's it. The user Icinga have to exist in AD, quite sure. No, it does not. It's a local user. It has nothing to do with the Active Directory because the Icinga user is created locally on the local machine with a random password of 60 digits, which is not stored anywhere on the system. So not even I know which password the user is running with. If I reinstall the profile, then the password is recreated so we can update the service users. So if I want install update JR profile, for example, I can execute it again. You see some warnings here because there are some add type definitions. It gives you a warning about add type because it's C# code. So every module that has a type inside, you should review it to ensure that it's a secure module for execution. Same goes for script blocks. Script blocks inside PowerShell scripts and modules are forbidden by default. But you can also create a profile by allowing script blocks, but you should review the scripts and modules before. So basically, we have now a user, and the user is called Icinga. That's a local user, and the local user is entirely managed by Icinga for Windows. There are some key facts that are required. So if you already have a user Icinga installed on your system, don't worry, Icinga for Windows will not touch it because there are some parts of the user that are checked before to ensure that it's actually managed by Icinga for Windows and not by you. You can also create the JR profile, for example, without the managed user. Then you simply have, for example, if you have a user monitoring already in your environment and the service user from the Icinga agent is set to this monitoring user, then you simply have to use install update JR profile, and then it will execute the command for this user installed. The files itself for the entire JR handling are in the framework folder. You have here Icinga for Windows PSSC. We can have a look on that. That's basically the initial file the JR profile will be registered in. And we also have role capabilities with our PSRC file. And this file contains every single function and commandlet that is required for Icinga for Windows. So every single module we installed is listed here, which is required, which is loaded. And then we have our visible functions here that are handled by Icinga for Windows. So if you install a new component, for example, if you install Hyper-V plugins now, then the Hyper-V plugins are not part of the JR profile, which means they will not be able to run on the system. You have to update the JR profile by simply running install update JR profile to compile the new catalog, which is, as you can see, it's quite fast. As long as you do not update the framework or anything related, the framework dependency list is not recreated, that's stored. It will simply use the framework functionality loaded from a cache file. And if you're curious about that, inside a cache folder, there's the framework dependency JSON. And if you want to know which command is using which commandlets and functions, you can have a look on that, because every single command and function which is being used by Icinga for Windows is listed here with its dependencies. So you can recursively get to know what functions set Icinga cache data is actually requiring. And as you can see, it's quite a lot what we are using. And this list is generated once. It will automatically be recreated once you update the framework. So you should be fine with that. And yeah, the most important thing is about JR is that every JR command is run within the WinRM service. So if you want now to restart your Icinga PowerShell service, for example, there is a new commandlet, restart Icinga Windows service, because there is a service pit now and a JR pit file. That means the service is having an own let's have a look. The service is having an own ID. That's 2344. Where is it? 2344. This is our PowerShell executed from the service. And we have the JR pit. And the JR pit is 7340 right now. And that one is this year VSM Prof host. And as you can see, no, that was wrong. WinRM component user. That's basically what you need to be aware of. Can I sort this by name? That's basically what you need to be aware of, that everything that is run within the JR context, it will be executed within a WinRM instance. So the WinRM service has to be configured, it has to be available on everything newer than 2016. It's already configured, which means you're ready to go. On 2012 R2, you have to enable PS remoting. And if it's done, then you are free to go. In addition to that, JR is only supported with PowerShell 5.0 or later. So if you're running 2012 R2, you cannot use JR until you update the Windows Management Framework to 5.0 or 5.1 or later. So you have to update 2012 R2 to or 2008 R2 to use the new PowerShell. Speaking of that, I have tested every single command with 2012 R2, so everything is supported in 2012 R2 and later. Older versions, like always, they might work, but we can't guarantee it. And yeah, if you want to use JR on 2012 R2, you have to update the PowerShell first. I understand right that we are able to install the framework, the Icinga user always one PowerShell statement using a local repository, for example, when we've installed a new Windows server. Yes, exactly. That's true. You can configure everything in a very easy way to be available in your local environment without internet access, and then you can simply run all commands, all handling to install everything. And in addition to that, if you run the installation with the management console, let's do a new configuration right now. Let's say you connect from your Windows system to the Icinga environment. You can select that. You connect your host. You select what your master zone is. I do simply a quick note now. So it's 20. What you can do here, for example, on the summary, you can install the JR profile as well. You can change the user and so on. So everything can be done directly from here. If I go, let's say 18, let's say install JR profile with managed user Icinga. Your stable repository would be C users public Icinga stable. So that's your local repository. Preferably, this is your Icinga web or your Icinga satellite environment. And if we now hit installation commands, then we have our configuration for our zones and so on. We have the host name selection, what our parent zone name is, our stable repository defined. We have the JR profile defined. We have the connection handling that we connect from Windows to Icinga, our parent nodes, and we can use this command now to manage every single machine within the same network zone for exact configuration. And then also the JR profile is generated, the users are created, and everything is managed. And in addition to that, you can also add more commands, for example, to install different components. So in the future, we will extend the functionality for the automated installer for the installation command a little more, because right now, if you want to install the MS SQL plugins, for example, you simply have to add install minus a single component name MS SQL. That's right now not possible because it's way too much for the initial configuration. But you have an automation running anyway, or you have some sort of deployment mechanism, you can simply add the installation commands to it, because regardless of what you do, they will install the components from your repository defined. That's basically it. Yeah, so that's basically JR. So as you can see, the checks are working fine. I'm not sure right now why the time plugin is not working. I will have to recheck that on why this plugin was not added, because as you can see, every other plugin is working. Yeah, but basically that's the that's how the installation and configuration of JR is working. It's straightforward. If you have the PowerShell before 5.0, the JR profile entries will be disabled, and you will receive a note that you require PowerShell 5.0 or later, and will also print you which PowerShell version you currently have installed. So that's it. You get a message as well there. Now, let's talk about one thing that was the performance issue. So one thing you need to know about Jaya is that based on how Jaya is internally handled on Windows, what happens is that when you execute a check, for example, it right now will create one PowerShell instance. And in this PowerShell instance, all your checks are executed. So, yeah, like every other plugin. Now, if you run the plugin in Jaya context, or if you have Jaya enabled, what will happen is that Icinga will start a PowerShell instance. The PowerShell instance will check, is Jaya enabled? Is the Jaya profile present? If yes, then it will create a new PowerShell in which the actual check command is executed in, and then it will return the result. Because otherwise we have no idea of fetching the exit code of the PowerShell, which always resulted in OK checks even when they were critical. Now, what does it mean for performance? Because I won't hide it. If you have performance issues right now with the checks and you enable Jaya, the performance impact, if you're not using the REST API right now, will increase a little. That's fact. If you are not running the REST API service with the API checks, the additional spawning of the PowerShell will result in even more CPU impact than right now if you enable Jaya. So, however, if you're running the REST API daemon, which we highly recommend you do, because we will also remove the experimental flag on the REST API part, so we encourage you to use it, is that we can, if we hit manage environment, we've installed API checks and REST API already. We hit PowerShell framework, manage background daemons, register background daemons, and then we enable start Icinga Windows REST API. Yes, we want to enable it. Now, the management right now for the console is a little limited for the background daemons. We will improve this later on with 1.7.0 and beyond. So, what we need to do right now is we enable the background daemon. If you want to run the Icinga service or the Icinga PowerShell service in a Jaya context, which right now it does, and you want to use the REST API, you need to run install Icinga for Windows certificate. Now, what it will do, by default, like the previous implementation of the REST API, it will look up the Icinga agent certificate, and based on this certificate, a new Icinga for Windows certificate is generated, which is created under the certificate path. So it's right here, certificate, and here you have the Icinga for Windows certificate. This certificate is then required for the REST API, but only if you run the REST API in Jaya context. Otherwise, it will not work because the commands being used for handling the certificates are not present within the Jaya context. They are not there, so you can't manage them. That's a security benefit, so you have to generate the certificate beforehand. Now, we have the certificate generated. We now add Icinga REST API command, and that's now to allow our REST API to execute certain commands, and that's invoke Icinga check. We whitelist it, so everything that's followed invoke minus Icinga check is now allowed, and you can execute it. And then we simply say restart Icinga Windows service. If you use Jaya, always restart the PowerShell daemon with restart Icinga Windows service, because this is the only way of properly cleaning up the WinRM service behind, without having to start the WinRM service. So we terminate the Jaya session with that one. So please always use restart Icinga Windows service if you're going to use it in Jaya context. Now, we can have a test. Set Icinga TLS version. That's just for the local handling now. Enable Icinga untrusted certificate validation. And if everything works fine now, I should be able to call the local REST API. Localhost 5668. Fingers crossed. Yeah, it works. So, our REST API is working. We call the checker command. And let's call invoke Icinga check CPU. Invoke Icinga is not whitelisted. Invoke Icinga check CPU. Invoke Icinga check. What? Okay. What? Ah, I missed something. Endpoint is... Oh god. Is it that one? By the way, that's the reason why it's so important to have the management console, because even I can't remember all the commands and all the different namings and handlings of it. And the funny thing is, the learn. I think it was learn. Let's have I have to look on the documentation myself. So, REST API, whitelist and blacklist for commands. And that's API checks. Okay, it's API checks. So, yeah, it's the name of the module. Now we restart the service. And now we can execute the CPU check. Once the daemon is ready. It takes a while. Here we are. So, now the CPU check is executed over the REST API and everything is fine. And if we have a look, for example, on our... what takes longer regularly? Let's see. Here. Our CPU check right now, it takes 6 seconds to execute. Which is quite a lot. But also, it's running in Jaya context. So, yeah. 6.28 seconds. Now, enable Icinga framework API checks. This warning, the experimental warning, will be removed with 1.6.0. And now, let's check again. 6.28 seconds is right now the check execution within the Jaya context. And now it's 3.6 seconds. It still takes a while because the PowerShell needs to be started and the call needs to be made. Now, here are some things we want to improve in the future. We do not want in the future that... So basically, this will later on be the default. To ensure that the PowerShell service is running in the background and it will interact with REST API calls to execute every single check. This has a huge benefit because the performance on the systems will drastically decrease, because then you will not have to start any PowerShell session or anything related, because the daemon is running in the background, it has everything inside its cache, and it will execute the plugins. Now, on the monitoring conference this year, we hopefully have a very, very cool solution available for that, which will also get rid of the PowerShell instance the Icinga agent right now has to start to execute the REST API call. That's something we want to implement. That there is no requirement for local PowerShell to be started by Icinga to execute a check. So maybe join the monitoring conference, osmc.de, I think is the URL. Maybe we have something there. I've submitted a talk, and hopefully, yeah, have a look there. Hopefully we have a solution by then, at least for prototyping and beta. Yeah, so basically that's it. Even by the way, even the PowerShell service behind is now running in JR context. Even that is now a thing. So the point is, you're fine. The funny thing is, that's interesting. In JR context, it's working. Locally, not. I think there's another issue here. But as you can see, even the time plugin is now working properly. And it's also running in JR context. Everything is running entirely in a JR context. And yeah, basically that's it. I can do one small more thing. And then if there are any more questions, we can go into them, for example. Because mostly I'm done anyways right now. So what we can do is inside the PSSC file, inside the root folder of the framework, there's the Icinga for Windows PSSC file in case JR is enabled. What we can do now is we can add the administrator inside. That's a manual step right now. Because that's just for debugging anyway. Register, pay a session configuration. We can do name Icinga for Windows. That's the name of the JR profile. It's called Icinga for Windows. Pass is the PSSC file, false. Now the plugin is enabled, and what we can now do is PowerShell configuration name Icinga for Windows. I hope this works now. No, it doesn't. Okay. Because the idea was administrator. Yeah, should have worked. So the idea was you can add normally your user inside. And do I have to restart the WinRM service? And then you can test the commands inside the shell. No idea why it's not working right now. But it's basically one benefit that you could, if the user is added, you actually could enter a PowerShell session with the configuration, and then you can test if all your commands are working properly inside the JR context. That's just for debugging. I'm not sure why it's not. I didn't save. I think I didn't save. Because Visual Studio Code is not. No, it works. I didn't save the file. So now with the configuration name, we're inside the JR context, and now let's have a look. There's no autocomplete available, as you can see. Service is Icinga 2. That's working, and I hope this is not working. Yeah, restart service. I can't run restart service because it's not loaded within this JR context. And I'm sorry. So basically, that's the point on how you can actually check if your commands are working inside the JR context. Yeah, and that's it. The plugin is working, and everything is fine. And everything that's not present within the JR context, I can't execute here. And yeah, so that's more advanced security. It's not a 100% solution. I totally agree on that. There are some caveats that are also explained very detailed in the documentation, what JR is, what it isn't. That's everything public available in the Icinga for Windows documentation, because there are certain ways to work around that, but therefore if you install everything inside program files where you require administrative privileges to make modifications, then you should be fine. Because the issue is that if someone adds you a certain module and you automatically add it to your JR profile, that's of course not very good. But if you have it in the program file to require administrative privileges to place files there anyway, yeah, it's just some certain things to be aware of. And yeah, they are all documented on the JR documentation on Icinga for Windows. So, do we have any more questions? Is there anything I can answer? Because these are two more crucial parts right now. We have the repository management, which I think is very cool. It allows some more easier management of the environment. And we also have the entire JR profile, the entire JR context, which will help a lot to get things done. If you want to use JR, you have to update most of the modules. You have to update the REST API, you have to update the API checks, the plugins have to be updated. Anything else, I'm not sure. So basically, update the entire environment if you want to run JR. So it is highly recommended. Use 1.6.0 with all the latest released packages, because there were some changes in certain modules to ensure that they work properly inside the JR context. For example, the file hash plugin will not work with JR if you run the framework in 1.6.0 and the plugin with 1.5.1, for example, because the get file hash function we use here, we can't load in JR, so we had to design our own function to get the file hashes properly. And there are more of these topics, so update your entire environment and then you can use the JR handling. And feedback is always welcome. If you have an idea for improvements and so on, simply write us an email and and so on. Why reachable in red? Because this is a machine which is a virtual machine on my laptop, which is not accessible from the Icinga master because it can't access this IP. That's why it's red. It can't ping it. There is no network route for the Icinga 2 master to the system. That's basically it. Okay, so I have some small things in addition to that. What's next? As mentioned before, improve performance on smaller systems. We already talked about it. Please, if you have performance issues, try out the REST API and the API checks. It helps a lot. And we will build on that solution to further improve the performance, and hopefully in OSMC we will be able to talk about more on what we have in mind about that. In addition, what we want to do is with the next releases, we want to encourage more developers to take action, to develop plugins, own modules and features. 1.7.0 will shift more into that direction as well. So right now we rebuild the entire base, basically on how to manage everything and how to secure everything. And with 1.7.0, we want to make it easier for developers to get started, to write own modules. We also want to make it more or easier or even possible to hook inside the IMC to actually get custom menus and every single custom configuration that could be possible inside. So it's way easier. Of course, this release will not bring any new plugins because simply we had to focus entirely on the repository management and the JIA context. So with 1.7.0 we will also add new plugins and improve the existing ones. There are plenty of feature requests open right now that we will handle with 1.7.0. In addition, that's more of a long term, we want to enable IMC to manage your Windows infrastructure, or basically your Icinga for Windows infrastructure. That's an idea that we had in mind. So we have lots of customers, also smaller businesses, which are actually running Windows environments. They have no Ansible, they have no Puppet, they have no SCCM or anything related. So the idea is that we will use the IMC to allow the management of other Windows systems. Of course, that won't be possible in big industries and big environments in a lot of cases, but that's a feature which might be helpful for smaller environments or for environments where, for example, PowerShell remoting is no problem. So yeah, that's an idea. And of course, all your feedback and ideas. If you have a feedback, if you have ideas, please submit them, open a GitHub issue, write us an email, post on the community forum. We will read it, we will go through it. And my response time is very bad on community forum posts. I apologize for that, but I'm pretty sure Foy will always remind me if there is anything there, because I'm not looking there into it too frequently. I'm more looking into GitHub if there's anything. Everything is updated inside the master, so if you want to test JIA, if you want to test everything I showed today, check out the latest master branch from the framework, from the plugins, from REST API, and so on. Everything is already present there, and I will bring it to you. No worries. Thank you. That will be great. So if you want to test it, if you have some feedback, on Tuesday, 1.6.0 will be released. So if you can't wait, test it right now. Hopefully there are no issues remaining. We will do some more deep dive tests now, ensure that everything works on every single Windows environment. There were some patches for 2012 R2 already, which 1.6.0 did not work, which are already resolved. So if there's anything, please give us feedback. On Tuesday, we will hit the release. And yeah, then hopefully we don't have to release 1.6.1. That would be great. So thank you very much, everyone, for tuning in. That's it for today. And yeah, thank you very much for joining in. I hope you took some feedback or some ideas with you. I hope I was able to show you what's new and what cool excitements we have. And yeah, stay healthy, have a nice day, have a nice week, and hopefully we'll see you on OSMC this year. Have a nice day, and thank you very much. Bye!